Hello, this is David Burton, and this is a re-recording of the first webinar in the series of dealing with essential practices for improving nutrient management in Atlantic Canada. This is sponsored by the New Brunswick Soil and Crop Improvement Association through their OFCAF program, and is co-sponsored by the other Atlantic OFCAF programs. In this first webinar, we're going to talk about what I think is one of the most fundamental aspects of nutrient management, and that's soil sampling. How to properly characterize your soil and understand the status of your soil such that you can use that information to make further decisions as to what needs to happen. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so soil sampling and soil properties. I should note that this webinar qualifies for certified education unit credits. This is the thing you have to scan it within your certified crop advisor app to get credit for this. I'm also going to show this at the end of the webinar for if you didn't capture it now. Okay, today I want to talk about four things: why soil sampling matters, soil sampling procedures, and soil sampling procedures and methods, and how we can collect that sample in a representative way such that it is informative in terms of understanding the state of soil in the field. I also wanted to spend a few moments talking about soil organic matter and cation exchange capacity, because they're important aspects of the soil that we're not really going to talk about, or I guess we are going to refer to constantly throughout the series, but I wanted to spend a few minutes introducing them here in this first episode. And then finally, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about how we might interpret soil testing results. Okay. In Atlantic Canada, we have a number of unique challenges. We have soils that are naturally acidic and require regular liming. There's a high rainfall risk associated with the climate of this region. Therefore, we can lose a lot of nutrients through leaching. We've had historically a fairly large amount of soil organic matter loss, and that's influenced the fertility and health of our soils and influences our nutrient management decisions. And also we have topographically and spatially variable soils that are often in close proximity to water bodies or are overlying sensitive aquifers, emphasizing an increased importance for effective nutrient management such that we don't contaminate those water sources and impact them. So why do we want a soil sample? I like something that Christine Morgan from the Soil Health Institute said: if you treasure it, measure it. Too often we're trying to make decisions about nutrient management without measuring the state of the soil. And therefore we're really kind of operating in the dark. And so we want to know what the state of the soil is so we know how to manage it. And so soil sampling is a foundation for effective nutrient management. It allows us to optimize our nutrient use, therefore reduce our costs. So we're only using the nutrients we have to, but we're also avoiding any yield loss because of poor nutrient balance. So it's that balancing act. How much nutrient do we need to get the most profitable yield, and ensuring that we're not putting on nutrient that we do not need. It's also a way in which we can protect water quality by avoiding nutrient or reducing any nutrient runoff that might occur. And oftentimes nutrient management or soil sampling may be part of a regulatory requirement for participation in something like the OFCAF program. So what are we sampling for? Well, traditionally we've done soil sampling for basic fertility. The measuring the soil pH, lime requirement, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium contents, micronutrient content, cation exchange capacity. More often now we're doing an expanded concept of soil analysis where we may include total organic carbon or organic matter content, total nitrogen content, Even further, we're now starting to develop for the Atlantic region some nitrogen soil tests that allow us to measure the nitrogen supplying capacity of the soil or how much nitrate is already existing in the soil. For example, in Western Canada, they use the fall nitrate test to determine how much nitrate is going to be carried over to the next year. We don't use that in Atlantic Canada because most of the nitrate that exists in the soil in the fall is going to be lost over the winter, so it won't be available for the next year's crop. But we can use that fall nitrate sampling to measure how much nitrogen may potentially be lost and how well we did in the previous growing season in terms of meeting our nitrogen requirements and not exceeding them. In Ontario, they often use the pre-side dress nitrogen test or PSNT test, which measures carryover nitrogen and as well as early season nitrogen mineralization. One of the challenges with that test is that it requires a fairly rapid turnover from the time of sampling during the crop growth, usually in corn, just prior to the 6-leaf stage, and then a rapid analysis and returning the results back to the producer so they can make a decision for in crop nitrogen application. And we don't always have that lab capacity within the region for the PSNT test to support the PSNT test. We've been developing a nitrogen mineralization potential test that relies upon a soil sample taken in the fall. We do an analysis on the potentially mineralizable nitrogen, and we use that to predict how much nitrogen is going to be mineralized during the growing season. We often may be sampling for physical properties as well, things like soil texture, water content, water holding capacity, soil aggregation and its resistance to rainfall disruption. Also, we increasingly are using other aspects of the landscape, like its topography as measured through LiDAR, or its electrical conductivity that says something a little bit about topography, but also the electrical conductivity or the ion and the amount of ions that are contained in various parts of the soil and landscape. And so that can allow us to better understand how that soil exists within that field and how the various regions of the field differ. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And now we're also starting to measure biological properties. There's a lot of interest in measuring the soil microbial community. We're a little bit challenged to know how to use that information, but I think as our understanding of how agricultural management practices impact soil microbial community, we'll better understand how that either facilitates or impedes the biological function of those soils. Okay, so that's why we should soil sample. A whole bunch of reasons. How do we soil sample? What are some of the methods and procedures we use for soil sampling? So one of the really important things we have to do is make sure that when we collect the sample, it represents that which we're trying to characterize and that which we're planning to manage. So some of the decisions as to what we soil sample and how we partition that soil sampling unit depends on how we plan to manage it. So it is really critical that we get a good representative sample, or else we could be managing based on poor information or misinformation. So ensuring that we fully can characterize the area and that we've done it in a random fashion or a structured fashion such that we can say something about the state of that system. There are 3 common approaches that are used. The simplest is a simple random sampling using a Z pattern or some sort of pattern as you walk through the field to sample all the or as many elements of the system of the field as you can. Sometimes we know something about the field already. There's actually 2 fields. One used to be and get a lot of manure, the other one didn't. We probably want to sample those separately. And so that we'd use something that's called a stratified random sample. So we'd random sample each of the elements of that system and analyze them separately because we might be managing them separately. Or perhaps we're going to manage sample the higher aspects of the field, the higher slope positions versus the lower ones, because we want to understand what are the limitations of nutrients within those 2 locations within the field. That's a stratified random sample. The other most intensive sampling pattern is a grid sampling, where we sample points on a regular grid to try to get a detailed map of the distribution of the nutrients of interest within that field. And that's often useful for nutrients that don't change a lot from year to year, and allows us to do a lot of statistical tools like interpolation to get a very detailed map of nutrient availability within that field. And that's often the kind of sampling you do to support something like a variable rate nutrient management plan. What are the kinds of tools we use? Well, oftentimes this oak field sampler is often what the recommended tool, where what it is that you insert this into the soil and you get a representative sample with depth. One of the problems with using a shovel is you're not going to necessarily get the same amount from each depth, and therefore that sample could be biased by where the sample came from within the soil profile. This core device, which is called an oak field sampler, provides a much more uniform sampling. It gives a small enough sample that you can combine many samples together, mix it up to get a one homogeneous sample that represents the multiple sample points that you collected, and therefore is less expensive to send to the lab rather than sending each of the individual points separately. The problem with this tool is that in the stony soil, you're often going to hit rocks. And as a result, it may be very difficult to actually collect the sample. Or in a very compact soil, very dry soil, it may be hard to actually push that in. So we could use a hydraulic core sampler like this, mounted on a truck or an ATV to collect samples. And if oftentimes some of the commercial firms that collect a lot of soil samples will use a tool like this. One of the ones I note also, this oak field sampler comes with a back saver attachment, a handle that you use your foot to put in rather than your back. If anyone's tried to do much soil sampling by using their back too much, you'll find the next day you regret that you've done that. This back saver can really improve makes it a lot easier to put in. It's a lot easier on your back. Here's a sampler that I particularly like, which we call an oak field sampler. And so what it is, it's a bit of an auger. So it twists into the soil and takes out a nice representative portion of soil. And because it twists in, it can avoid rocks. So it's often very good when we have very dense soils that are hard to penetrate, or very rocky soils. And so we can always get a sampler. Sorry, this is called I think I called it an oak field. It's actually called a Dutch auger. Okay, so we have our tools. I should also say that in addition to these samplers, you want to be able to take a couple of buckets out to the soil, depending on how many depths you're sampling. Because one of the things we often do when we soil sample is we'll sample from various points, combine them in a single bucket, homogenize them, and then send that homogenized sample or a portion of that homogenized sample to the lab. That allows us to sample many points and combine it to get an integrated measure of what is in that field without having to pay the cost of analyzing each individual sample. You also will want to take some sort of container for containing the soils. We often use plastic bags, and some sort of marking device that will provide a permanent marking on that bag. There's nothing more frustrating than getting a sample into the lab and the markings have been removed or have disappeared, and therefore you really don't know where the sample came from, and it's not very useful at that point. Okay, we have our tools, we're going to the lab. Well, we've decided whether we're going to do a random sampling, a stratified random sampling, or a grid sampling. Again, we've made that decision based on field history or other aspects of the field we understand. Well, maybe some part floods, or you often see a particular disease or nutrient deficiency symptom in one portion of the field, and you want to separately test that. We also can use aerial photography or GPS mapping to help decide where in the soil we want to stratify, if indeed we want to stratify. One of the really important things is when you're sampling, assign permanent terminology to the field and the locations within the field that you are separately sampling. You probably will remember it this year, but 5 years from now, you may not remember what that is, or the next owner may not know what that is. So Brown's field or the field behind the barn, not very effective labeling. It's better to develop some sort of systematic labeling and put that on a map so it's really clear where that sample came from. In general, you should not sample areas much more than 25 acres in area, because we're now not really characterizing that soil very well if it's too large an area. And we should sample every few years. For some tests we want to might want to do more frequently, but generally every 2 to 3 years is sufficient. Again, these are the three approaches: a composite sampling or a random sample, a stratified random sample, or a grid sample. Um, so in this composite sample, we just randomly locate that, some sort of walking pattern to the field. We collect 20 to 30 subsamples and combine that in to make the sample that we submit to the lab no more than about 25 acres. And with the stratified, we've broken the field into areas that we think we might be managing differently or would want to consider managing differently. And finally, the grid sampling is a much more detailed, systematic way of sampling that landscape, a much higher cost, but in some cases, for example, variable rate technology, that cost might be recuperated in more efficient use of nutrient. And so how do we divide a field? Again, it depends a little bit on the kind of nutrient we're looking at. More nutrients that persist from year to year and don't move around very much makes much more sense to invest in a more intensive sampling period or sampling plan. Nutrients like nitrogen, which is highly variable both in space and time, perhaps not so much. But as we develop the nitrogen mineralization potential test, that test is a little bit more like phosphorus, and therefore systematic sampling might be more related. I'll talk about that when I talk about nitrogen in week 3. So this pattern availability can be used influencing application rates, again, particularly with variable rate technologies. But this grid sampling is indeed the most expensive sampling because you're taking the most samples and analyzing the most number of samples. Here's a little example I want to show of how some of these properties can vary within the landscape. Too often we think about a field as being uniform. Well, they're not. They're just not. So this is a study that Bernie Zebarth and colleagues did in New Brunswick. It's a commercial field near St. Andre, New Brunswick. It's been cropped to potatoes at the time of sampling, and they sampled it on a regular grid of 33 by 71 meters. And what did they see? Well, first of all, they're soil scientists, so they mapped out the soil properties, the soil types. There were multiple soil types that occurred within this field, somewhat related to landscape, because landscape is an important factor or topography is an important factor that influences soil formation. And so we had basically 4 different soil series that occurred within that. If we looked at some of the properties, other properties, here we have the actual elevation, and you here see that field had a low spot in the middle. So this particular soil series was associated with more lower regions. This series with the higher elevations, as was this series. And then there's another little intrusion there that was probably from some sort of variation in the parent material. When we measure the electrical conductivity, we see zones of higher soil electrical conductivity, suggesting ions are accumulating in that. Perhaps there's less leaching, or there's maybe a history of higher rates of fertilizer application in that part of the field. One of the things we're trying to do with our work is use a more detailed variation of understanding of differences in elevation and electrical conductivity to understand how various properties might change within the field. Commercially, this is a product. There's a number of companies that offer this kind of a product, but in the Atlantic region, one of the common ones is what are called SWAT zones, where they actually delineate 10 different management zones based on these remotely sensed and electrical conductivity sense properties. And they'll suggest that nutrient management will occur differently in those zones. We're adding on to that concept by actually trying to predict the amount of the nitrogen mineralization potential and growing season mineralization based on some of those topographic characteristics, such that we can get a very detailed map of the nitrogen mineralization that would occur during the growing season. And you'll see here there's quite a range from about 180 to 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare to very low rates here that less than 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So that's important variability that, if we can accurately predict it, should be influencing our nitrogen management in that system. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in later episodes. Depth of sampling. This is often a little bit of confusion. So the rooting zone can go well below 6 inches or even 12 inches, but oftentimes we'll only sample the 0 to 6 inch or 0 to 12 inch profile, because that's the profile where there's the most nutrient availability and the most activity, and where plants take up most of their nutrients. So it's not a complete characterization of nutrient availability, but it's representative of nutrient availability. One important thing to check is check with whatever lab you're going to be submitting your sample to find out what depth they've assumed you're sampling, or whether they're going to do separate analysis depending on the depths you choose to sample. Some labs will sample 0 to 6 and 6 to 12 separately and use that to provide you information or suggest a recommendation. Others will simply use a 0 to 6 inch depth. So make sure you know what the lab is assuming you're sampling, and sample accordingly. Oftentimes in Atlantic Canada, we use shallower soil depths because when we get beyond 12 inches, it makes it almost impossible to collect a sample. So sometimes that's just a practical consideration. I've referred to the fact that oftentimes you'll take many 10, 20 samples and bulk them into a single container, mix them up, and take a subsample to submit to the lab. That dramatically reduces your analytical costs and actually allows that single sample to be more representative than the single point in the soil where you might have sampled it. It does not give you as much of information about the variability of that nutrient within the field, but oftentimes we're much more interested in the mean than the standard deviation. When we are interested in the standard deviation, that's oftentimes when we'll use something like a grid sampling approach. When to sample? Well, again, this is somewhat an issue of practicality. Oftentimes soil samples are collected in the fall because that's when we have time to sample it, and that's when the lab has time to do the analysis and get the results back to you. Spring sampling is problematic in terms of it's a very busy time of year, and oftentimes the lab simply won't be able to turn it around quickly enough for you to use that to inform that year's nutrient management planning. One note though, in Atlantic Canada at least, if you're sampling for nitrate, do not sample in the fall because most of that nitrate is going to be lost. If you're trying to track nitrate, sample it in the spring. The one time where we do fall nitrate sampling in Atlantic Canada is when we want to monitor how much nitrogen was left over from the previous crop as a way of assessing how well our nitrogen management program was working. How many samples? Again, collecting a minimum of 20 samples from each field of 10 hectares or less. And in some cases, we'd be sampling regions of the field separately. Again, that's that stratified sampling. Very large fields should be divided into subsections because there's likely going to be variation as you move across that field as a result of soil formation or past land use. Again, when you're going to submit to a particular lab, consult with them beforehand as to how they want to receive the sample, what they're assuming you've done to the sample. Are they assuming you've air dried it or sending to them moist? And what information do they need about your field? This is particularly important if you're expecting recommendations back from the lab. They need to know something about your cropping system and your past cropping system and what you intend to grow in the coming season. If, in fact, all you want is the analysis, you don't necessarily have to provide that information. You also want to confirm whether or not the lab uses regionally accepted methods. I'm going to talk about that when I talk about phosphorus, the importance of the MELIC3 extraction. Most of the recommendation protocols we use in Atlantic Canada assume a MELIC3 extraction. So you want to specify from the lab that you want MELIC3 extraction for the samples that you're submitting. That also ensures that the extraction methods match the recommendations that you'll get for the region. Keep the samples cool and dry. Don't throw them in the back of the pickup truck on a hot day, and submit them promptly for timely analyses, timely results. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about soil sampling methods and procedures. I want to talk a little bit now about soil organic matter and cation exchange capacity. Well, what is soil organic matter? Well, soil organic matter is the glue that holds all the bits and pieces in the soil together to make something we call structure. The pore network and the aggregates that allow both air and water to persist in soil. And that coexistence of air and water is critical to root growth, critical to the organisms that live in the soil. Physically, soil organic matter forms these aggregates and the soil structure, and that determines the water holding capacity of the soil, but also determines the ability of the soil to drain. So if the soil is poorly structured, there may be ponding and waterlogging that soil, and at the same time, once it does drain, it may not hold much water, and therefore will not provide water to the plant. So that physical structure is really important. It's also really important in terms of the susceptibility of that soil to erosion. Better structured soils are able to retain the soil in the landscape and avoid erosion. Chemically, soil organic matter has a really important role in cation exchange capacity. It's often, in our soils, it's the major source of cation exchange capacity. It buffers the soil pH, so it resists soil pH change. When we're liming soils, often we're also trying to influence the pH or the cation exchange capacity that's associated with this organic matter. Organic matter also can attenuate contaminants. When we add particular contaminants to soil mistakenly, it's the organic matter that can bind those contaminants until they can be degraded by the soil microorganisms. So soil is in many respects the ultimate cleaning body of our planet. It removes a lot of those contaminants and degrades a lot of organic molecules. Biologically, organic matter defines the habitat of the organisms, both in terms of the pore sizes, which they have to navigate through, but also in terms of the substrate in which they're living on. It's their food. And as a result of that process of eating that food, they mineralize nutrients to plants. And so nitrogen mineralization is nothing more than the decomposition of organic matter, which provides nutrients to the plants. If we look at the importance of organic matter in terms of cation exchange capacity in our region, and I'm going to talk a little bit about cation exchange capacity in a moment, but suffice to say, our soils suffer from very low cation exchange capacity. So we want to do whatever we can to improve that cation exchange capacity. Well, it turns out most of our cation exchange capacity is associated with organic matter. So this is a survey of cation exchange capacity and organic matter from Nova Scotia as part of the Nova Scotia Soil Health Survey. And we found that 22% of the cation exchange capacity was explained by organic matter and only 5% by clay content. And that's in part because we have very low clay contents, but also the kinds of clays we have don't have very high cation exchange capacity. In Western Canada, the vermiculites and smectites that often form their soils have very high cation exchange capacities and allow those soils to better retain base nutrients. Soil organic matter is also a critical component of aggregation. So here, as part of that same Nova Scotia Soil Health Survey, we've measured the water stability of aggregates. So we take a soil and we place this aggregates over a sieve, and we have a simulated rainfall on top of them, and that causes some of the aggregates to disperse, and some of them can resist that rainfall erosion. We want ones that can resist that rainfall erosion so the soil can maintain its structural stability. And one of the things we see that is when we have low organic matter, we have almost uniformly low water percent aggregates that resist rainfall, that are water stable. So a very low percentage of water stable aggregates. When we have a high organic matter, we have the potential for water stable aggregates, but not always, and it's not assured. Okay, some of that is a function of the degree of soil disturbance and how those soils are being managed. But to have high percentages of water stable aggregates, we need to have higher organic matter contents. What influences organic matter content? Well, one of the major influences is cropping system. The other one, of course, is soil disturbance, in other words, tillage. Um, so cropping systems that add a lot of organic matter to the soil in terms of crop residue or very fine roots, especially very fine roots like cereals, tend to increase soil organic matter. Crops that don't add much organic matter and result in soil disturbance, such as potato production, tends to result in declining soil organic matter. And that's in part why in this region we're seeing declining soil organic matter, because we transitioned from a cropping system that was based on a lot of perennial forages and pasture systems, and we've cultivated those soils to transition them to more intensive production systems like potato production, and that's resulted in a significant decline in organic matter. We're now looking at ways in which we can try to still cultivate those crops, but find other ways of returning organic matter to the soil to build up that organic matter and improve the health of those soils. But here we can see we have organic matter content. Again, this is from the same soil, Nova Scotia Soil Health Survey. We can see that the organic matter contents are very much related to the cropping system. Wild blueberry, basically a non-disturbed system, can have very high organic matter contents, whereas systems that have much higher disturbance like vegetable production or field crop production can have lower organic matter contents. In the Soil Health Survey at Prince Edward Island, we found the frequency of potato rotation was inversely related to the organic matter content. So the two elements, how much organic matter is going back, and also what do we do with that organic matter? Once it goes back, do we leave it undisturbed so it can build soil organic matter, or do we till it? The degree to which we can reduce tillage results in greater organic matter accumulation. And the decline in organic matter content in Eastern Canada in general is well documented and is of concern. This is from the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Agri-Environmental Indicators series, and you'll see the darker green spots are where they have the largest decreases in organic matter content. And we go back to that study in New Brunswick that Bernice Zebras conducted, and you'll see that as we just look at some of the different aspects of the system, so the clay content, remember this is the lower part of the landscape, the clay contents were actually higher in this area. Remember, that's the area that had the higher electrical conductivity as well. Soil organic matter content was highest actually in the higher parts of the landscape, and that's probably reflecting some sort of past land management as opposed to topographic influence, whereas the water holding capacity was higher in some of those lower parts of the landscape. So this is an example of where actually examining the landscape may result in some patterns that we hadn't really expected, but still nonetheless impact the behavior of nutrients in those fields. Again, from that same thing, total nitrogen, very much mimicking the where the organic matter was found, because most of that total nitrogen is associated with organic matter. The labile nitrogen is again somewhat in the similar region, and the nitrate concentration in the same region. But again, we've got some spots where we have some higher nitrate accumulation as well in other parts of the landscape. So we need to measure to understand. Okay. The final piece I want to do is, okay, we've done our soil sampling, we've got our soil test result back. How do we use that information? Well, one of the really important things for me to emphasize here is that when you submit a sample to a soil for soil analysis, they use some sort of extractant that measures an amount of nutrient. That amount of nutrient is not actually the amount of nutrient that's available to the plant. We estimate the amount of nutrients available by the plant by correlating that nutrient content, that extractant removal of nutrient, with a field test of nutrient response, or the crop response to nutrient under field conditions. So for a soil test to be valid, it has to be field calibrated. And in the 60s and 70s, we did a lot of field calibration and calibrated all these major tests like MELIC 3 and built a whole series of calibration curves such that for particular crops, we'd understand what the critical threshold values are. We'd often define These threshold, the soil test level as either very low, and that's a situation where the soil supplies relatively small amounts of nutrients, and we need to add fertilizer to build that up to meet crop demands, to low and medium, where the soil is supplying more and more, and therefore the fertilizer requirement is more and more, to high, where in some cases we may not even need fertilizer, or in very high, where we absolutely do not need any additional fertilizer for that particular nutrient. So the concept is that this soil test is indicative of the amount of nutrient that will be available and therefore the requirement of fertilizer, but it's not a direct measure of it. So one of the things we have to measure is, if that test is not calibrated, how do we know how much fertilizer to add? It's not simple mathematics. It's based on that field calibration. And that's one of the challenges I think we have in the region, is that many of those field calibrations are quite old and are done with practices that we're no longer practicing, or varieties we're no longer using. And so there's a real need to reconsider and recalibrate some of these tests to ensure that we're getting better information as to the nutrient supplying capacity of our soils under current growing conditions. So how do these feed calibrations, how are they done? Well, again, in the 60s and 70s, we did a lot of work doing this, where we'd have numerous rates of fertilizer application. We would have soil tested this field. We've done replicated trials of various rates of nutrient application, and we would have generated a nutrient response curve. And we would have used that nutrient response curve of saying, what's the low zone, what's the medium zone, and how does that relate to the soil test value? Very expensive. And that's part of the reason why we're not doing it anymore. There's just not the resources to do that, or to do those kinds of testing anymore. So one of the more innovative ways that people are starting to do it now, that we have more capacity to measure yield and nutrient content within your own field, is that we often will do in-field calibration trials, where instead of doing 4 or 5 rates, perhaps we'll only consider 2 rates. Maybe my historically used rate, and maybe 10% lower or 10% higher. And we'll calibrate within our own field whether that additional nutrient application resulted in additional yield, or most importantly, whether that was an economically justified addition of fertilizer. In other words, did the fertilizer generate sufficient additional yield to pay for itself? And increasingly what producers are doing these trials on a regular basis to try to fine tune and calibrate their soil test values to their crop response, to understand how that relates to their own field. It's a little bit challenging to get your head around how you do that, but once you've figured that out, it's actually a very powerful technique to understand how your fields behave. Because the other problem with some of these historic crop response trials is they're often done on experimental farms, which were the ideal soils. They located experimental farms on really nice land. Well, your land isn't necessarily as nice or as their land. So sometimes the yield, the nutrient response values from those fields didn't actually tell you very much about your field. So these in-field calibrations seem like a much more innovative way to actually say, what is the nutrient response on your field, and how does the soil test values that you're using relate to that nutrient response value? Okay, this is an example of the nutrient response concept that I was just speaking about. So when we have very low rates of nutrient availability within the soil, even small amounts of fertilizer will result in dramatic increases in yield. And that's where we want to be adding fertilizer, because it's going to pay for itself. It's going to increase yield. It's going to return more than the cost of the fertilizer. But as we get up to medium and high rates of soil test values, oftentimes the response is much more limited. And it may or may not be the case that the cost of that additional amount of fertilizer actually results in a yield that pays for the fertilizer. And so that's why we're often we're suggesting that we should be targeting the most profitable rate of fertilizer use, that is that rate where simply $1 of additional fertilizer results in at least $1 of additional yield. And certainly up at high and very high rates, we should not be applying fertilizer at all, because there's no response to it. It's not economic. The one exception being is that oftentimes we will supply a little bit of fertilizer at the beginning of the season, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, to help that plant in the early part of the growing season before it really has its root system established. So early in the growing season, there still might be a need for a little bit of starter fertilizer, even once the rates are a bit higher. And oftentimes we'll be applying manure even in these situations where there are high rates. And that's a bit of a problem because that manure may be being applied because there isn't a land base to apply it anywhere else. But that's creating a situation of excess nutrient accumulation, resulting in a potential for environmental risk and ineffective use of those nutrients. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the very last episode in this series. But one of the things I really want to emphasize is your goal should not be to maximize your yield. Your goal should be to maximize your profit. So in other words, ensuring any additional money you put into your field is at least paying for itself. You're not putting fertilizer on just because. It needs to actually pay for itself. So in terms of interpreting these soil test reports, there's certain amounts of constant information that these reports provide. They provide analysis of the sample, so they provide you with the actual results. In some cases, in most cases, they'll actually make a lime recommendation. One of the biggest issues that we have in Atlantic Canada is that many of our soils are acidic, and the pH value of those soils is interfering with nutrient availability. I'm going to talk about that next week when I talk about managing pH in soils. So oftentimes there'll be a lime recommendation. If you've provided the intended crop, it will provide nutrient addition recommendations based on provincial averages. A provincial average may not be the best descriptor of your situation, your area, your farm, and sometimes those provincial recommendations are also quite dated, and so they need to be interpreted with a certain degree of, with a grain of salt, as they say. Some additional information may also be provided, like recommended practices in terms of fertilization, split application, those sorts of things. And in some cases, there's also a soil health assessment if you selected that package. So here's an example of a soil test report from the Prince Edward Island Laboratory. Again, we have basic nutrient levels and organic matter content, so pH, sometimes a salt index, not so much in our soils, but sometimes in greenhouse soils. Certainly in Western Canada, that would be much more of interest because they often do have saline soils. So a lime index. One of the things I really want to note here is you'll note that this is presented as phosphate P2O5. That's not suggesting that the phosphorus exists in the element or in the molecule P2O5. That's a historical convention that simply represents the most oxidized form of that compound. It doesn't exist as P2O5. It's just a convention. And so the important thing to note is that some labs report phosphorus as elemental P, just based on the P alone, and some report it as P2O5. Those numbers are different. So you need to know, it may be the same phosphorus availability, but the numbers are different because they're reporting using different conventions. Know which convention your lab is reporting in. Also note that this is in ppm, parts per million, or really probably more correctly, micrograms per gram of soil or milligrams per kilogram of soil, parts per million by weight. Some of the other labs use a conversion to convert that to kilograms per hectare because that's a number that might be more useful to you. They've assumed a bulk density of the soil in doing that. And they've assumed a bulk density of the soil and the depth of sampling. And so because they're changing a volume into an area. So again, you need to be aware of what those assumptions were and just be also very clear that a phosphorus content based on ppm is very different than a phosphorus content expressed as kilograms per hectare. So just know what the units are that the soil test report you're getting is expressed in. And some of the other things you'll get here, particularly you're seeing more and more of this phosphorus to aluminum ratio. And when we talk about phosphorus, we'll talk about phosphorus aluminum fixation and how that influences phosphorus availability. Sometimes the calcium to magnesium ratio, that's a little bit controversial. In week 4, I guess, 4 or 5, we'll talk about base cations and that the concept of sufficiency versus soil building. And the cation exchange capacity of the soil and base saturation. Again, note these cation exchange capacities are really small, very small. In Western Canada, they might be 3, 4, 5 times higher than that. That's important because that cation exchange capacity is what allows the soil to retain the base cations. Our soils are not very good at retaining them, and that's in part why we have to continue to supply them. This is a similar sort of report from A&L Labs, another lab that's commonly used in the region. Notice here they're reporting the phosphorus in elemental P as parts per million, but using 2 different extractants. Now, I've been told that when you submit your test, you can request that Melic 3 be used as the extractants, which you should. In some cases, there is conversions between the various extractants. I'm not a big fan of that, but that is something that is done. They provide the actual amount in ppm, but they've also given a rating based on some sort of assumed cropping system. I should note that these ratings are crop specific, and so you need to tell them what the cropping system has been before them to generate that rating. Again, pH and the buffer pH, and then buffer pH is what determines how much lime you need to adjust or to modify the pH. Talk about that next week. Base saturation. And here we're getting some other ratios, and this is expected nitrogen rate. No, this is a nitrogen supply. I can't remember what ENR stands for. But it's a predicted nitrogen supply to that system. So these soil test reports will typically show the phosphorus, the macronutrients, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, sometimes micronutrients. Note that in many cases, however, micronutrient availability is better assessed through plant tissue testing as opposed to soil testing, because oftentimes the micronutrients, there's a lot of micronutrient in the soil, but it may not be available to the crop. The soil test analyses are reported differently by different labs, and there are these 2 conventions, P2O5 versus elemental P. So elemental P times 2.29 equals P2O5. K2O is the other convention that's often used. Elemental K times 1.2 is K2O. And again, the difference is that one uses the weight of the oxygen, and the other one uses just the weight of the nutrient itself. Again, to convert to kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, you have to assume a bulk density, and I'm not going to go over this calculation, but basically a hectare of soil weighs about 2 tons, or 2.2 tons 2 tons per hectare, or 2.2 imperial tons per acre. These soil ratings, we talked a little bit about these previously, but basically what they're suggesting is low to medium, you probably need to add fertilizer. High, maybe not. What are the economics? How expensive is the fertilizer? Is it going to be worth it? Very high to excessive, you probably don't need fertilizer. Maybe just starter. Note these are also fertility ratings. They're not environmental ratings, so even at a medium rating, there could be potential for environmental impact. It's a separate analysis, a separate evaluation. Okay, finally, I want to talk a little bit about soil health assessment. One of the new options that have occurred with the labs in the region is you can actually have a soil health assessment done of your soil. And that measures a number of additional properties beyond simply the chemical fertility tests. So soil health is this concept of the physical, chemical, and biological aspects of the soil coming together to establish the ability of that soil to function. Because it is all 3 aspects of that soil that actually allow it to function. So should we be measuring the biological and physical as well as the chemical? Yes, and that's what soil health testing is all about. So often the additional parameters that will be measured are things like soil texture, aggregate stability, water holding capacity, organic matter content, active carbon, in other words, a more dynamic particle carbon fraction, soil respiration, the respiration of the microbial community, nitrogen mineralization potential, what's the nitrogen supplying capacity of that soil, and often a phosphorus index, which talks about the availability of phosphorus based on aluminum content. And this is an example of a soil health report from the PEI lab, again, representing the various elements or aspects I just referred to. Note the units can differ quite a bit. So micrograms per gram or milligrams per gram, percent. And interpreting those units is still, it's still somewhat difficult to interpret those units because oftentimes they're not absolute values that you can refer to. And so we're still developing the means by which we can better understand how we interpret these. Oftentimes they'll be expressed relative to other growers in your region. Are you in the lower 10%, the upper 10% of growers who have submitted samples? A&L Lab does a similar soil, they call it the Vitalis Soil Health Report. They report the Solvita CO2 is a respiration measure, but is also used to predict nitrogen mineralization potential. They have a potentially mineralization number, which is similar to the nitrogen potential measurement that the PEI lab does as part of their BNA test. This is the biological nitrogen availability. That's a measure of nitrogen mineralization potential. This is the same sort of a test, although this one's measured by CO2 burst method. And they'll also give you, they place that rating in context, whether it's that your ratings are low, medium, or high relative to other producers. One of the last concepts I want to really sort of emphasize, I've sort of referred to this already, is that we really should be making our nutrient management decisions on a profit first concept. Our goal should not be maximizing yield because that's often not profitable. We should ensure that the nutrient applications we're making are actually paying for themselves and therefore generating profit, not taking away from profit. So, target yields are fine as long as they're realistic and you assess whether they're profitable. Trying to do a little bit 5% better than last year, it's not a good strategy. You're going to lose money doing that. So you should fertilize for the yields you're getting as opposed to the yields you wish you're getting, and you should be checking to make sure that those yields are actually profitable in terms of the nutrients you're putting on. Particularly this year, nitrogen is so expensive. So one of the first things we should be saying is, how much should I reduce my nitrogen rate so I'm still in the region of being where I'm still profitable? I shouldn't be saying, oh, geez, here's how much nitrogen I need to maximize my yield. I guess I'm going to lose a lot of money this year. Absolutely the wrong approach. Make sure that the cost of the nitrogen fertilizer influences the rate you decide to apply so you're still remaining profitable in terms of your nitrogen use. And it's important to remember yield response is not linear. The first additions are going to result in much more increase in yield than are the final additions. And it's at some point, there's no increase from additional nitrogen fertilizer. And too often, this is actually where we are in our region. We're farming up here, we're striving for maximum yield, and we're putting on more nitrogen than we're using, and that's costing us money. Okay, that's what I wanted to talk about. I talked about why soil sampling matters. I talked about the methods and the procedures to collect soil samples. Spent a little bit of time talking about the importance of organic matter and cation exchange capacity. And I spent a little bit of time talking about soil test reports. In future webinars, we're going to dig in a little bit more detail on most of those aspects and look at them within the context of specific nutrients and specific management activities. I indicated that here's the thing you need to scan into your app to get credit for this seminar. But I also wanted to highlight a couple of things, a couple of resources. One is this this textbook, John Havlin's Soil Fertility and Fertilizers, is by far the best textbook in terms of soil fertility. Goes into a whole lot more detail than I've covered here. I've used a number of graphics from that text in this presentation, but certainly if you're an agronomist or a nutrient management planner, you should have this book on your shelf. It's a very good reference. I also want to highlight Farmers for Climate Solutions and their Farm Resilience Mentorship Program. They have a learning hub, free of charge learning hub that has a lot of lectures on fertility, particularly with respect to nitrogen, but also in terms of cover cropping and rotational grazing. And again, that's a free to use hub. It's also a way in which you can connect with other producers that may be experiencing similar problems. And there's some back and forth as to how those problems were solved and questions answered, that sort of thing. So I would encourage you to consult both those references. I'm going to stop sharing, and that concludes the first episode. Next week, we're going to talk about pH management.